We're having some fun and games with connection. So Tony from Ding, as you can see, is joining me. Phil was with us 30 seconds ago, but now has disappeared off. So I think we're just going to have a few gremlins. I can see Phil. Here comes Phil.
Marvellous.
Marvellous. As soon as I get Phil to join us in the 3, he drops off.
Okay. He's in
Such
France.
is the joys of going live.
This is going live. You see, this is what live TV is all about.
Absolutely terrific. So today we're going to be talking about diversity, and we're going to be talking about learning, training workshops in that arena, because as you know, we're running a diversity group with the FRB, and it's going really well. It's interesting because it's a little bit under pressure with Phil at the moment, diversity, and we're getting to the reasons why. Part of it is people being... Phil, good morning. Can you hear us? No. Okay.
Keep going,
so part of the reason why diversity is struggling a little is that there's a real fear now from a lot of people for getting engaged with the subject. And anyway, I was talking to Tony the other day about this very subject, and I suddenly uncovered wisdom in my group of friends and colleagues that I didn't know existed. And it's a real joy when you find that sort of wisdom sitting just underneath your nose. So welcome, Tony. Welcome, Phil.
I got here in the end.
Hooray. Excellent. And your background looks very dramatic, Phil. Please tell.
It looks like a fake background, doesn't it? But it's actually a real background. I am currently joining you from rural France. So I don't know if that's got something to do with some of our connectivity issues, but you're obviously doing very well without me. So if I do disappear, that's what's happening, I think.
Well, I was just going to ask, is that a real background? Because that's extremely impressive.
It is. Look, real fire, everything.
It's perfect.
It's official.
That's a screen. It's a plasma screen you got in the background.
I promise you, it's not actually. Anyway, yes.
Okay. So nobody criticised the French president or anything like that, because we'll go straight off line. So I was just saying we're talking about diversity today, amongst probably a couple of other things, and I uncovered this wisdom sitting right underneath my nose from Tony that I've known for years, and Phil that we've known over a few years, and so I'm delighted they're joining me today to talk about this. Now, Phil and Tony, you're both from the world of education and academia in different roles. So perhaps, Tony, you could just give us a little intro into your engagement with diversity in the work you were doing at Guildford University.
Yeah, sure. So I used to run the teacher training program for the university, and as part of that, a key aspect of your role is to help staff who are tutors, or there are the new tutors, or there are existing tutors who are doing a teacher training qualification, to sort of open their eyes to diversity, inclusivity, and increasingly neurodiversity. So
perfect.
It was a real privilege in many ways, because it's a difficult subject, obviously a complex subject. It's multifaceted, and it has to be approached very sensitively, as you would expect. And so, what would often happen as I was supporting tutors through this program of learning, which was, how to help them support their own students, was that occasionally they'd realize that they themselves were neurodiverse. They might realize that through discussions around ADHD, dyslexia, autism, they may actually realize that they themselves had those characteristics. And you had to be very sensitive around this, because obviously they then had to internalize that knowledge, remap their own view of themselves, so that they could then think about how that impacted their students. So yeah, it was a privilege and a complex area to support people with.
And this is fantastic, Tony, because we're helping businesses with diversity, and this is what they're finding, especially with in this arena, perhaps more than most. They're coming across people that it so slowly dawns on both parties, probably, that there is something in here which is outside of the normal, whatever that may be. So we'll get onto that at the moment. Don't everyone's shouting down the phone at me, everyone's neurodiverse. I know. I'm just saying out of that general term of what's normal. So Phil, Tell me a little bit about your experience and how what you've done in the past.
Well, I would say that my ability to talk about neurodiversity was sort of bequeathed me by accident, because I, for a long time, was course leader for an animation degree. I've always been interested in storytelling and world building, and as a child, I was a classic introvert. My father used to say to me, "Why don't you just go outside and play football like all the normal boys? Why are you in your bedroom writing a short story or drawing things?" And I didn't know this when I began my tenure running this course. I didn't know that I would be running a course that was kind of powered by neurodiversity. And I think you might say that animation potentially is the secret history of neurodiversity as it plays out in the arts, because and again, you have to be so careful, and we're going to tread these eggshells for this entire time around making generalizations. But it was true that a high proportion of my students were neurodiverse, i.e. they either self-identified, they were statemented, or they became to understand that there was this other expertise or perspective at work in themselves. And my final comment on that would be that for me, neurodiversity was always synonymous with huge amounts of creativity, extraordinary work ethics, and an amazing insight. So for me, neurodiversity very quickly became the new norm, but also became essential to some of this extraordinary work that these young people were making. So for me, it wasn't so much, oh no, we've got a problem on our hands. It was like, oh, we've got like a culture on our hands, and it's a very powerful and influential one. And I think it's probably responsible for a lot of the cultural benchmarks that surround us in life. I'm thinking of comic books, I'm thinking of movies, I'm thinking of special effects, I'm thinking of all those huge, the gaming industry, I'm thinking of these huge oil tankers that make all this revenue that's taken for granted. I have a slight feeling that is a creative sector that's powered by neurodiversity to a greater or lesser degree. What do you think about that, Tony? Was that a fair expression?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Yes, I think that was one of the privileges of working in a creative university, a creative arts university, was that you would see neurodiversity everywhere. And if you were, I say, if you expected that wasn't the culture, then you were confused. As you say, it was integral to your course. It was integral to what I was doing. And as you looked across the disciplines, across the creative disciplines within the university, then you realize that, like you say, it is sort of the secret history, the secret curriculum, and that it was, as you say, a hugely powerful force. I think that's the thing, is when you start to look at how neurodiverse individuals start to deploy that, you suddenly realize the huge benefits that it can bring. But I think it's interesting looking at it in a workplace culture, because I can see, and although I'm projecting into this space slightly, but you could see how that could create problems for individuals around how to negotiate that, as in who's leading this, and where's the solid ground, if you like.
Well, Lee, I mean, I would just to continue that. I think.
Here we go.
Hello. We were just continuing to say, that there is an interesting distinction here between talking about sort of an institution of creativity. Oh, I've gone now. No, I'm still here. Institutions based on creativity. We were just getting, I think, to the idea of the pinch points about where neurodiversity and the workplace and sort of more professionalized expectations and literacies live. And certainly I will say that although I recognize that my community of experts were neurodiverse and powerful because of it, there were definite pinch points at the point where they left that environment to move into more professionalized spaces, more social workspaces. So I'm not going to say that those challenges were not there. I'm saying that they became more and more part of the discussions that I was compelled to have if I was doing my bit around employability, professionalization and preparing people for the workplace. So that would be the caveat, and it's a big caveat. And I guess it's really why we're here talking about it, because it's that point where those skills and those aptitudes meet the workplace, right?
Yeah. It's while you two disappeared, I was also talking to myself, as it turns out, and I was going in the same sort of direction. That when people join a business, they may be aware that they have some diversity. They may not be. They may have lots of different levels of help and support as they come in, and that varies a great deal. And part of what Tony mentioned, this discovery as people work and as people, usually as they get older, because you get a bit more self-reflective, I think. And certainly now, as it's talked about more, there is this self-discovery, which is really interesting and potentially difficult for everyone involved. I'm glad we've come onto this subject. I sort of thought we'd come onto this subject a little bit later on, but Tony, you mentioned sensitivity about neurodiversity. Have you ever had to go about trying to help somebody discover that there is something different, and perhaps that's the cause of their having some struggling in some areas, but also excelling in other areas? Have you had to have that conversation?
Yeah, very much so. And obviously bear in mind that whereas Phil was working with sort of 18 to 22-year-olds, I was probably working with people from 30 to 50. So it was a slightly different demographic, but obviously the same experience in terms of that realization of, oh, hang on, I'm learning about this thing, and it's sort of helping me remap my views of myself. And it's hugely delicate. I remember a person who was on the course that I was teaching the first time we went through neurodiversity, and this person realized that they were dyslexic, and they ended up leaving the course because it was so powerful in terms of she remapped her entire experience, and it was really quite traumatic because she suddenly went back to childhood and why she'd struggled in school and all this kind of thing. So you had to be so sensitive around it, because it forces you to, it remaps your view of yourself. So it's a hugely powerful thing. But at the same time, people would then understand that actually maybe this is why they'd made the decisions in their life, or why they'd had certain friendship groups or done certain activities. And so the important thing about my particular course, I guess, was that it was a safe space to talk about those things. And I know that a lot of the discussions in how to raise awareness of neurodiversity in organizations, there is this piece around education. And I think that's great, but also a problem, because as soon as you start talking about needing to educate people around something in a business, either people fall asleep or they think, well, I've got to send this person on a training course. And it's the wrong sort of approach, really. You need a supportive environment where you can learn about it, talk about it, but also figure out how to make practical changes in a safe space. So that is a better approach than just educating people, but one way or another, we have to help people learn about what neurodiversity means for them and for the environment they're working in, but also create the conditions where they can explore that and feel safe to do so, because it is hugely destabilizing. It is metaphorically like pulling the rug out from under you, or can be. Yeah,
certainly. It's Phil, I guess you've been in the same position. What were the key takeaways for you if you had to have if you sort of got into a conversation with somebody that previously had no idea or might have even understood the subject, but it becomes apparent to that person? How did you approach that?
Well, for one thing, and this is one of those blancmange answers, that what you realize is you have to go case by case, for one thing, because one of the things that I'm keenly aware of now is that concept of intersectionality, which is that you can have someone who's dyslexic and highly extroverted. You can have people who have decided to mask as a kind of a professional mode of practice, and they don't want to have a conversation about it because their power comes from having decided to strategize around what the world might conceive as a deficit. So the thing I became very conscious of is that if you went in there with your head like this, tell me about you could very quickly get that wrong immediately, because the one thing around neurodiversity, I suppose the clue is in the title, which is that it doesn't make people the same. It doesn't make the group the same. It makes the group wildly different. I mean, for example, dyslexia and autism, you know, they are entirely separate sort of expressions of a word that seems to make it easier for us to apprehend. And actually, so I would say the advice I gave myself was to press the reset button every time I met somebody who I began to suspect was experiencing challenges that were connected to traits that I'd become to be better at spotting, and then treading very, very carefully indeed to ensure that I wasn't just dealing with someone who was very, very shy, for example, you know, or someone who was anxious about talking to me because I was in a position of power or something. So I don't want that to be an unhelpful answer. I think for me, it was like, I'm going to meet each of these people case by case, because I think the advice can sometimes be the wrong approach. Like the sort of the policy can sometimes get in the way of making someone trust you and be able to talk about themselves. So I think policy and that good work, the project of putting a policy around something, can sometimes produce strange and unintended consequences.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there, Phil. I know a very good company for training coaches, and you're halfway there. So congratulations. You're halfway through your course for coaching. As people know, I'm a coach, and I'm halfway through doing neurodiversity coaching, which is a bit different. And what you said, and I love setting that comment, setting the reset button every time you talk to somebody, is spot on, because you don't know how it's going to manifest in that person. And there is lots of interconnections between the different types of neurodiversity, if you want to use those global terms. The other thing I think that you're touching on there is, especially things like ADHD can have a real impact on someone's emotions and someone's emotional control. Not everybody with ADHD, but some people with ADHD, for instance, can have a struggle with that control of their emotions. And it can be a very sensitive time, as you said, Tony, for anybody. It's difficult to know how to take that forward, but dealing with the person is ultimately what you need to do, is help and support that person. Now, having said that, you've also mentioned about putting things in place. And how do we help? So we know that if we start doing discussions or any sort of training on neurodiversity, we open up a can of worms, and I think it's still a good thing to do. I don't ever think knowledge is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. So as Tony, you were saying earlier, just giving somebody the knowledge to help them reset their whole lives I never think it's going to be a bad thing, or very rarely a bad thing. It may be short term a bad thing where people have to reassess themselves. Yeah. But once you've done that, then how do you go about? How do I put this? There's a myth. No, there's not. There's some actual instances where doing things will help everybody, but there is also that can be overstated in some cases. So things that we're talking about here is giving people advance notice of the questions in a job interview. Making a job interview video like we're doing now rather than a written piece, giving people very clear instructions how to get to the interview room. All these sort of things we know can help, but it's not going to help everybody, and it's could put a huge burden on a company to introduce those things. So when you're looking at learning design, which both you guys are involved in, what sort of things do you look at building into a learning experience or a learning journey that is sort of adaptable for different ways of thinking? How do you approach that?
It's a good point, and I think one of the ways in which we approached this when we were trying to educate teachers, if you like, or teachers, was trying to identify the changes that they could make in their teaching that benefit everyone. Because, as you say, although this is often a uniquely personal experience because we're all individuals and we're all different. There are some things broadly that the research has shown does help everyone. And one of the key things when we were working with educators was to try and trigger that shift in mindset. So rather than adapting things for one person, it's what changes can you make broadly that benefit everyone, and then from there you can look at individual approaches to specific cases, specific individuals. So in learning design, there are some key things around when you're designing resources. For example, if you're making a video, making sure that there are subtitles available, because you're then anticipating the fact that somebody may be watching that who has low vision, or low hearing, so they can watch the subtitles, but also then they've got a video. So you provide what's often called multiple means of engagement. So you basically provide a range of ways for people to engage with things. So there are, and colored backgrounds on slides is interesting, although we did a podcast recently with a specialist who's a chap who's just written a book on dyslexia, and he said you have to be careful there around certain colors work for certain people and not for others. So, again, it's about providing choice and enabling people to make informed choices. Like when you're reading a website, can you change the colors of the background, or can you enable someone to change the colors of the background so that they can choose a color that works for them? So there are things that you can do broadly that, again, informed by research, that do support everyone, that do benefit everyone. Signage, as you were saying, making sure that there are signs available for everyone. Often that can be a problem. Thinking of font choice, often that benefits everyone. Clear writing.
Tony, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm sorry, but what do you mean by signage?
So signage in an institution. I remember where we went through a phase in a previous institution where a new management team decided to get rid of all the signage because they didn't think it worked with the brand. And actually that wasn't great for people who struggled with orientation or figuring out. Turned out
it wasn't great for me. I mean, to be honest, it's like,
But we did a piece recently, Phil. I know you made a video about this around, does inclusive design need to be boring? And it absolutely doesn't. But maybe it'd be interesting to just talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think this comes to this broad point I was making about a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. And you often see that in policy where, for example, the idea that a colored background is the answer to diversity. So suddenly that's what happens. And then and ideas get cleaved to, and it can often also mean that if you are trying to be inclusive, all of your materials or all of your presentation of those materials need to somehow be incredibly dull or sort of like institutionalized or something. And I just think that's the difference between the wisdom of the thing and the application of the wisdom. So the wisdom of the thing is to remain, and this is hard, and this is hard certainly if you're trying to do something once and implement it, but it's to remain alive to your wisdom, as opposed to letting the wisdom become received knowledge and it just gets stuck in the organization, and that's what you're doing. And people, that's where I think a lot of this stuff ends up being a bit tick box like, because it feels like, well, we've made all of our we've put all the A4, we've changed all the A4 color paper to sort of pink, so hooray, we've resolved that. And I think as human beings we find it really, really hard to remain contemporaneous to wisdom. We tend to like as soon as we think we've got some research, we put it into policy, and then we'll discover like 5 years later that this thing needed to be sort of kept alive in discussion. And I think that's where the real challenge of sort of EDI work in institutions and organizations, businesses, I think that's where it lives, that it doesn't die the moment it's implemented. You know what I mean? That it doesn't become an also-ran. So yes, it is hard to keep. So this idea, for example, and I think this is broadly true, that if you remain empathic at all times, it's hard, to what it's like to be new in your organization, what it's like to be pre-onboarded, what it's like to not know anything. If that's your start position, I think you're more likely to be an inclusive and diversive performance of the organization. And it's so for me, it's remembering what it's like to be on the outside that really for me is the wisdom that would drive diversity and inclusivity. It's like, why does this organization run this way? Why is that door the obvious door? Why do we do it that way? What would it be like to have nothing and arrive on day one? And I think that perspective, that persona, can really help drive living inclusive practices, if that makes sense.
So there's some great stuff in there, Phil. Great description of wisdom. You'll become an honourable member of the FRB if you keep on describing wisdom so well. Because spot on. Knowledge is one thing, wisdom is another, and that's what we're trying to get to here. The thing about looking at a company from the outside in, you have to be a little bit careful, because by definition you're looking from your own perspective, but which is a trap we can fall into. But that I totally endorse what you're saying. The other thing is that some organisations almost set out to drive conformity, because they see conformity being efficient, they see it being easier to manage, and they see it being something that they understand. Where some organisations don't want to do that. And increasingly, organisations are not trying to get the cookie cutter. Take someone out of university that's or college or school that is full of vibrancy and creativity, and slowly squash them down to something that they can see and understand. So that's a fundamental piece for organisations, is to accept that difference. But we've also got to acknowledge that's scary. Okay, that's a scary thing, right? There was somebody I knew very well, had a lot of time for. They said everyone in our organisation is now empowered to be an entrepreneur. Well, everybody else in that discussion looked at it as if to say, "My God, that's going to be mayhem." Right? You can't have a business full of entrepreneurs; it'll just destroy itself. So, in between those two, you have to try and find the way forward. So, Tony, you're talking about having things available, which means you need to break the mold. One of the things that I've witnessed, and you may or may not have witnessed in large organizations, is something that Phil just hinted at a minute ago. If you're promoted, you do well, you work hard, you become a team manager, or you become a manager of some sort, or a senior executive, and all of a sudden you have to do a workshop. So you've got two things to rely on: what the company gives you as a brand, what you've experienced in the company before, and your own interpretation of what a workshop is. That may work well, but it may fail, because you're not thinking of the audience, of the people in the organization. How would you go around helping that person who's suddenly got to put together for the first time, or they've been doing it for years and suddenly realize, oops, I've just been on autopilot with my meetings / presentations? How would you go around helping somebody think a bit differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the thing we do a lot in learning design, is helping people problematize their approach to delivering.
Problematize, is that a real word, Tony?
Yeah, it is a real word.
It's a real word. Yeah, you basically it essentially means you look at something that somebody's been doing a lot for years, and then you say, well, why do you do it that way? So you turn it into a problem. And this is, so for example, I would have people who come onto the course, they might have done a bit of teaching, they may have been teaching for 20 years, but they'd never really thought consciously very much about why they taught in a certain way. And it often is inherited practice, much like you inherit the wisdom of the organization. You just have this view of what teaching is. So you either teach how you were taught, or you teach how you weren't taught because you had a bad experience.
Yeah.
And what we tried to do, or a key part of what we did through the teacher training program, and what we do when we're building learning programs that involve workshops, is to break that open and say, well, firstly, why are you doing it that way? Or what's informing that? What are your underlying beliefs and values about how you teach people? And once you've opened that up, then you can say, well, practically, let's look at a session plan. Let's look at what happens in 2 hours. And let's look at how we can make it about the people, about the learners, about the people who are going to be trying to receive that, and not about the teacher. And pretty much, Carl, that is the biggest shift that you're trying to take people on in teacher training, is to move away from it's all about me to it's all about them.
Yeah.
And if you can get that, pretty much everything else follows. But that is quite a big pendulum to swing. But once it swings, suddenly you just go, oh, okay, how do I facilitate learning rather than how do I deliver information? And that is the fundamental shift that you want to take people on, really.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. I remember many years ago, a guy I knew very well worked at First Direct Bank, not Stuart, somebody else. And he was then moved into the mothership, HSBC. And he ran a meeting, and he was very much on the sort of very people person, very coaching sort of mentality. And he opened up a conversation and said, well, this is what we're trying to do, and this is trying to, right, what are your ideas? And he got nothing. And then he tried again. He said, so this, we're doing this. And he got more and more enthusiastic because he's like this. And he said, what are your ideas? And eventually one of them turned around to him and said, sorry, you don't understand. We need a task, and we need to know exactly what quantifies and qualifies us as succeeding at that task. Can you go away and come back? Now, first thing is interesting. They felt empowered to talk to a manager like that, but it's exactly what you were talking about. Both sides, because he'd come in from a completely different organization, both sides were completely at odds with each other. That it wasn't going to work. So you're saying it's, and I think rightly, it's down to whoever's running that meeting to take the initiative to listen, observe, see what's happening, or even before that. Now you're saying before that to really break down what it is they're going to do. So if you don't know I guess in the business environment, you'll probably know your audience. Actually, thinking about that, if we're talking about internal meetings, you've probably got a fairly good idea of your audience.
Yeah.
So you're saying to assess that and then break down into manageable chunks what it is you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. Do I read that right?
Yeah, very much so. And I'd say you've highlighted there that actually there's a really important first stage, which is opening people up to looking at themselves in a way that they can see what they're doing and why they do it. And that unless you can become, or until you can become more conscious of why you lead a meeting in the way that you do, or why that guy walked in and went, hey, let's have loads of ideas. Until you can sort of get above yourself and look down and go, why am I doing it this way? And how's that going to land with those people? You will be, to use Phil's language, perpetually confused as to why you go into a situation thinking one thing and it doesn't land. So a key aspect of teacher training, particularly, but also when you're thinking about learning, is how to get, we use this sort of word, getting above the experience, is sort of going a bit meta and looking down on it and going, what are the implications of me going in with this view or this mindset? And why am I doing that anyway? Why am I going in thinking that I'm going to get this outcome? What's driving that? And you do have to do a little bit of introspection as to what am I projecting into this meeting? Like, why am I going in with this particular viewpoint? And is that going to land with those people? Are those people in HSBC able to do the thing that I'm going to ask of them? Or are they coming from a background and environment where that's just not going to sit with them? So before you go into that workshop, you almost have to look at the bit outside of that and go, where am I coming from and where are they coming from? And once we can look at those bits, then we can plan the bit in the middle more effectively. But you've got to get outside it before you can get inside it.
I mean, just to sort of like continue that, really, I sometimes get a bit frustrated in my sort of consultative role when we go into organizations and you see academics or business leaders or whatever slightly on the back foot because they've been burned once. And but I've got this, it's not on a tea towel or on a bumper sticker, but it should be. It's like, ask for what you want. And so, for example, in that example you gave of the meeting, if I was doing that, my first interest would be, what do I want from this? What is the outcome that I want from this interaction or from this experience? And then if you cleave to the outcome is you want this group of people to ideate freely, to sort of whatever, if that's the outcome. And then you recognize that culturally they don't recognize free ideation unless it's within the confines of a sprint or in the confines of a brief. You can still get what you want, which is basically ideation, but you need to sort of like ensure that the activity delivers on the goal. And I often think that it's that ability to work backwards from and be really confident about the outcome that you want. And I think sometimes people don't know why they're having meetings. I think they're having meetings to perform the necessity of having meetings. But I think, we've all been in meetings where sometimes perhaps we've been thinking, what is the goal of this meeting? What's the plan? What are we going to get from this? And I think in that instance, if I was sort of coaching and working with that individual, we wouldn't be moving the goalposts around the experience you wanted these people to have. What we would be looking at is designing an experience that they would recognize and they would flourish in, and that they wouldn't be resistant to. Because what you're experiencing there is how learners resist by using learners in that very broad sense of the audience for this activity that is new. Learners resist because they can't taste it, smell it, touch it, read it. They don't know what it is. And so they just fold their arms. And then what they did there was like, can you do it differently? Or can we not do this because that's not how we roll? It's a bit like, I always say to sort of people in that role, you've got to stick to one thing. And then the interesting bit is working backwards. And what are the activities, or what is the language? What is the positioning that means you can get what you want from that experience with these new people?
Okay, so a couple of things here. We are running over time, but I'm conscious we had a difficult start, so I'm going to carry on if that's okay, dear listener. Please carry on listening in. That meeting you're about to go to can wait, because it's not well put together anyway.
Oh, absolutely.
I've got to point out there are other banks available as well. It's not just HSBC. It's interesting, Phil, what you're saying there. It's always interesting. Is what can happen in a lot of business meetings is people do know why they're there, but here's the but. That objective is not held by everyone at the table. Mm-hmm. And this is something I help people a lot with, some senior executives that are struggling here. What I do say is that that's perfectly acceptable. Okay. You might want part of the team may want to get over here, another part of the team may want to get there. The leader may want more of this, okay? And the business may say, no, we don't want more of that, we want more of our bit over here. But that's okay, because that's the nature of a business and the strains of the business. I don't like this phrase, playing politics. It's not. There's tensions in a business, right? And there's always going to be. It's probably one of the big differences between academia and business is that there's more of these tensions exist, I think. But I think from what you're saying, you have to be aware of that. And I think I like Tony, this looking down on the meeting. What am I bringing in? What am I trying to get? I love the thought of thinking through that, because if you don't think through that and you don't acknowledge that these other people wanted to do other things, then it's a crazy meeting anyway, where someone ends up just trying to blast their way through by force of personality or being the most senior person in the room, and then everyone walks out of the meeting thinking, that's what we expected. The number of times I hear people say, I got what I expected out of the meeting, which is not a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Complete waste of
time. There's a book, Tony, do you remember the book? I gave the books out at one of the meetings we had a long time ago. Will There Be Donuts?
Will There Be Donuts?
Yeah. And that was a sort of premise of that was, if people are just turning up for the donuts or because they have to be there, it's not worth having a meeting. No. So you invite people to a meeting. If they don't want to attend because they're going to get something out of the meeting, then that's a better way to run a meeting. And I think what you're saying about how you design a meeting, put a meeting together, is along the same thing. That you're really understanding what it is you want to get, how you're going to go about getting it, and how you're going to go about getting other people to get there. I mean, do I read that right? Yeah. Is that?
I mean, another point I want to make, a threshold concept for me, which is a teaching one, but I think it's much more expansive than that, which is that one of my roles was in my former life was that although I ran a course, I was like the CEO, if you like, of the course. I was also a first-year tutor, which meant that I always met a group of people who were actually, you'd expect first years to be their most open to new things, but actually first years were, as a rule, the most resistant to new things. And one of the big mindset shifts for me was understanding that I was in the business of teaching those people, not the people I wish were in my meeting, not the people I wish had enrolled, but those people, and to treat those people with imagination and as a specific demographic. And I think, when I've done a few meetings, and people coming into meetings when they're busy are a resistant set of learners. there's resistances there because they can imagine being somewhere else. They probably imagine that this meeting isn't necessarily contributing to their targets and their pain points. It's probably just more work for them to do or something. And for me, I found the imaginative and compassionate engagement with first years as they actually live and breathe. And this comes back down to the inclusivity and diversity thing. It's an act of imagination, which is exhausting because it has to be contemporaneous. It's every time. But with that act of imagination comes a higher chance of being effective in front of those people. And I think sort of the meeting audiences, the sort of the people who go into meetings, and I, you said earlier about organizations businesses perhaps being a bit more political than academia. I would push back on that and say, wow, Elizabethan much. But I would say that sort of the meetings I've, particularly, for example, just very, very quickly, when I've had to go in and give best practice style workshops or meetings to my peers back in the day. So you had a group of other professionals, all who were busy. That was the hardest audience in the world because they weren't listening. They didn't like you. And to understand that was the job and to be compassionate around them meant that I was often more effective in those encounters than perhaps if I'd just gone in on the back foot.
Thank you, Phil. You raised some interesting points there. I found it very. I've done a lot of presenting at conferences and all sorts of things, large groups, small groups, and sometimes in my early days I'd get very fed up and a bit slightly annoyed if people weren't listening to me. But then, of course, I followed on, and I was listening to somebody else, or I wasn't listening to somebody. Well, I was listening to somebody else, but I wasn't giving them any attention because I was writing stuff down. And we had a famous case where one of the people, I was chairing a meeting, and one of the people said to call somebody out. He said, "Sorry, look, I'm talking here, and you're typing." Okay, and he said, "Oh, okay." He said, "But I was Googling you." And it was like, oh, shit, I've got all that completely wrong. So that attention thing is another thing. And remember, some people in a diversity spectrum will not want to make eye contact with you, will not want to listen to you. They find that's too difficult. It doesn't mean that they're not your most attentive audience that are actually analysing every single word you say and real-time analysing the implications of the words you're saying, right? But they won't be looking at you. You could argue that people that are looking at you and smiling have got nothing going on behind. Right, they're just looking at you and smiling with you because that's what the politics.
Hold on, Carl. I'm looking at you and I'm smiling, and I'm fully present. I promise.
Don't get me started on presence, right? and influence. So guys, I think this has been extremely. I think we need to do more on this because as you talked earlier, both of you have mentioned, just changing the background color of your screens, pre-sending notes, all those sort of things are good, right? Sometimes they help, sometimes they don't. But the real key to it is understanding what we're doing and why we're doing it, and breaking down. Especially, I would love to be able to now transfer your thoughts into businesses around thinking why I'm doing this, because so much of business just goes on what I've seen before. And so, from my perspective, it's been really good. Anything, Tony, just for you to put in on the end, or Phil, anything you'd like to drop into those reflective thoughts on our conversation?
Yeah, just one thing. Well, we haven't really mentioned bias, and obviously you could do a whole series of podcasts on bias. But I think if you just imagine that organizations, it's easy to think of them as a thing over there, but organizations are essentially a group of people, and people are all inherently biased. And if you look at the research into bias, it's like we are programmed to put knowledge in boxes. Knowledge comes in right from the age of like 1 or 2. We're going right, boy, girl, color, food, whatever, like file it. And comes back to Phil's point about keeping things alive. I think when you're trying to open people's minds to the fact that people are different, it is exhausting because you're fighting yourself. You're fighting your natural ability to go, dealt with it, filed it, know what this is, and it's actually that's the antithesis of what you're trying to do here, because supporting people around neurodiversity is keeping it alive, treating people as individuals and being present to that and being alive to that at every moment, in every conversation, every meeting. And it's exhausting because it's like system 1, system 2 thinking, isn't it? You're constantly having to think it consciously all the time and not just go, yeah, I know how to deal with this. I've done the color background, I've had that, and it's filed and it's done. So yeah, I think it isn't easy. We talked about inclusivity earlier, and for me, inclusivity is this continuum. You're constantly working towards being inclusive. You never get there. You've never done it. It's an ongoing process.
Tony, I'm sorry, we're going to have to draw us to the end in a minute, but I've got to come in on that. You always say too many interesting things. What you describe as that being able in the moment to generate and regenerate and do. Of course, if you're on a neurodiversity spectrum, you're going to find that in some cases you're going to find that a hell of a lot easier. So real-time analysis of what you're doing, why you're doing it, the reaction from the other people, how can I change it? Some people find that a lot easier. Some people thrive in it. Some of us love it. Okay, so interesting. Yeah, Phil.
So my final word is this. I think you began very at the beginning. One of the difficulties around this subject is that people worry about getting it wrong. They worry. It doesn't feel like for businesses, and it doesn't feel like a space because the language can be itself problematic and so on and so forth. And I think that, and what Tony was just saying about bias, I think one of the most powerful things you can do to reset the room in advance of this conversation is to admit that othering people is what we do for a living. If you are othering someone, it's not because you are a nasty piece of work. It's, as Tony says, cognitive biases, the ability to spot someone who's off kilter. We cannot help but other people who are not us, people who have got that, and we're picking up on micro signs, micro signals. And I think because people are having two thoughts at once, they're othering people and they know they shouldn't. And because of that dissonance, that's where they stop talking, because they feel guilt, because they know that they could lapse, they know that they could get this wrong. And I would say that is why policy gets made into concrete, because it lets everybody off the hook, because people say, well, we've done that now. But I think starting a conversation around vulnerability and the idea that othering is a function like breathing, but that's the beginning of the debate. It's not the end. It's not like, well, it's common sense, isn't it? This person's a bit different. They're weird. You can't make me change because that's people, isn't it? You can, that's the beginning of the place. You've just got to let people feel less shame about the thing they were doing anyway. And then perhaps you can have the conversation, and then perhaps you can keep them alive to the imaginative act, which is other people. I mean, finally, Sartre said that hell is other people. Famously, he said, hell is other people, and you'll never get to know anyone. Other people are exhausting. Communities are exhausting. Socializing is exhausting. If you're neurodiverse, it can be hugely exhausting. It can be the most exhausting terrain on earth. But I would also say for all of us, it is an exhausting, ongoing pageant. And I just think saying it out loud has powerful effects for creating trust and discussion, I'd say.
So thank you, Phil, for that. I would implore everybody to go and Google othering to understand what it means. I wish I had your vocabulary, Phil, every time we talk. And that is the trouble with talking to academics. But I absolutely love it, because you two guys always expand my thinking, okay? And that's what this is all about. And this is what you good two guys do as a living, is help people reflect, help people do things differently. And we just need to make that accessible for people within companies. It's not a painful process. I relish my time talking to you two guys, because it always leaves me in a better place. And that's what we need to get into, the diversity thing. It's not all about coloured backgrounds. It's not all about large expenses. It's not all about spending lots of money on blah, blah, blah. It's about changing the way you think about things. It's the way you put meetings and things together. If we can just get a few people thinking in that way, I think everybody will be much better off. So thank you, Phil. Thank you, Tony. We must do this again some other time when we haven't got a bad connection at the start. And I think we'll take it in turns to sit behind an exotic fireplace.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys. Speak to you soon.
Yeah, cheers, Carl. Thanks a lot.
Bye.